Welcome to Siliconsciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome to Siliconsciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and this week, as every week, we'll be looking at some dimension of what's going on in AI. Today, we are extremely fortunate to have with us Gregory Allen. Gregory is the director of the Wadhwani AI Center at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. And he is also the host of the AI Policy Podcast, which sounds like we're kind of covering some of the same stuff on a weekly basis. And I admire the work that you've been doing, and I'm really glad that we could have this chance to talk. Welcome.
Hey, well, thanks so much for having me on.
There's a lot to talk about, but I think, let's just baseline this thing. I know you start like the first week in November, you did a podcast, what is the Trump administration AI policy going to be? And you've been on that story for a bit. And so have we, and here we are, it's March, and I'm still not sure because it's a little schizophrenic as far as I can see it. There is an impulse among some of the folks from the tech community to say, leave us alone and just let us do our thing. And then there's an impulse from some of the folks in the tech community saying, please do us a favor and make it harder for people to compete with us around the world. In other words, don't be involved, maybe be involved a little bit over here. And they're differing issues, and there's an Elon school, and there's a Peter Thiel school, and there's David Sachs school, and there's a lot of stuff going on. So I'd like to start with your, sort of nutshell about what you think the vibe is right now, and perhaps how that differs from where we were with Biden.
Well, I think there's a lot of ways in which the second Trump administration is obviously being unconventional, to put it mildly. But I think what's interesting about AI policy, at least insofar as it's been going on, is, number one, they're doing very typical White House kind of things, right? They announced that they're going to have this plan for AI. They put out a request for information about what they should do, what they should include in that plan. All the big companies, all the big nonprofits, all the big, whoever is submitting, responses to that request for information. And then I think a process largely managed by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, which just got, its head in terms of Michael Kratsios, who was the chief technology officer the last time around and the driving force of the first Trump administration's AI policy. They're going to analyze all of those submissions, and they're going to come up with, what they want to say. I think another way of thinking about this is in the campaign era, almost anybody could point to something that was going on in the Trump campaign to suggest that they were going to get what they wanted out of the AI policy of the Trump administration. There was, a Trump supporter, a prominent, loud Trump supporter, advocating many different views of what AI policy should be. So it's really easy to say in a campaign, whatever it is you want, I'm going to give it to you. But once you're actually in the White House, you do have to pick winners and losers. And that's often much less fun and much harder. And so that's one of the reasons why you have something like a request for information process, because you want to make sure, like, okay, I'm getting ready to pick winners and losers. Is there anything that I might be missing before I make that decision? So everybody come out and make your best overall argument as to what it is that you think we ought to do when we're doing this.
Yeah, of course. Among the things that has changed is that when Biden came in, there was a small group of people who were kind of engaged in the AI story. And today there's kind of a law that every conference in Washington has to mention AI. Mm-hmm. Back then people were unfamiliar. Today, if you're doing medical research, there's an AI component. If you're talking about energy policy, there's an AI.
The New York Times had a story not that long ago about the intersection of AI and bird watching. So you really
that's where I was going.
There's an AI angle.
Yeah, that's where I was going. I was interested in your views on AI and bird watching, but the point is, so that has changed. But the other thing that's changed, in other words, the level of awareness is up, and everybody feels it affects them in some way, which I think is probably right. But the other thing that's changed is we've learned a little bit about how some of these policies work. And so, for example, the Biden administration was like, well, AI is a strategic centerpiece, for us going forward, and therefore we have to protect it. Small yard, high fence. The Chinese aren't going to get it. Countries that might trade with the Chinese aren't going to get it. We're going to monitor who gets the big, fat, juicy NVIDIA chips and who doesn't. And we'll control this, and people will beat their way to our doorstep because we'll have the best AI anywhere in the world. And so, now it's a little bit later. We know about DeepSeek. We know that there's some other competitors out there, that there may be some other paradigms out there. And we're starting to realize that as far as the rest of the world goes, they're kind of fine with the idea of just good enough AI. They don't need to have the very best cutting edge, bleeding edge to AI. They want to have access to it. They don't want to be left behind. They want to have control over it from the point of their own security. And so that's changed. It's changed the mood a little bit. How do you think that all is trending?
I think the mood is going to change again, basically. So one way that I think it's helpful to understand the DeepSeek moment, and I actually just published a paper on this topic last week, which is up on csis.org. So for those of you who want a 13,000-word deep dive into DeepSeek, Huawei, export controls, and the future of the U.S.-China AI race, that's up there.
You couldn't be promoting it in a better place.
And so I think the abridged version, to answer your question, is that DeepSeek does, in part, reflect the failure of the first tranche of Biden export controls. And it's not just me saying that. The Biden administration folks would say that. They got the performance threshold wrong in terms of what GPUs were being allowed to sell to DeepSeek, sorry, not to DeepSeek, but to China as a whole. They thought they were setting China back multiple years, but the way they designed the technical performance specifications, actually NVIDIA could just make one tiny tweak to their chips and degrade the performance, not by 75, 80, 90%, but something more like 10 to 15%. So imposing much less of a performance penalty than they thought. Those chips, those modestly changed chips, those are the ones that DeepSeek used to train this model. And so anytime you have export controls, at best they have a lagging impact. Just because you stop selling something to a country doesn't mean that everything that you've already sold that country magically disappears. And so we are currently living through the lagging impact of the poor design of the first tranche of Biden administration export controls. But in the not too distant future, we will likely be living through the lagging impact of the successful design of the second tranche of Biden administration export controls. And to a certain extent, we already are. I mean, the CEO of DeepSeek has said the number one challenge facing his company is these export controls. And you may have noticed that when DeepSeek launched worldwide, almost immediately they had to cut off new user signups because they ran out of GPUs. And it's not just them running out of GPUs. Even OpenAI is running out of GPUs. I mean, the demand for GPUs is effectively infinite, but there's a big difference between doing what OpenAI does, which is serve hundreds of millions of customers every single week, and doing what DeepSeek was doing, which originally was like serving handfuls of customers. And when they tried to open up into the world, they almost immediately ran out of computing capacity. So that's on that side of the equation. Now, you also mentioned the rest of the world and whether or not they're going to be okay with good enough AI. Well, I think if AI was going to be frozen in time and at the current performance level that we have for AI, I think that's probably true. I think people would probably say, oh, we're okay with good enough AI. But remember, DeepSeek is reflecting the lagging impact of these export controls. So DeepSeek's model is broadly comparable to the state-of-the-art circa mid 2024. I mean, that's what they hit. They have like an O1 class model, which OpenAI, developed and released in the middle of 2024. But the point is, like, these next degrees of scaling are still going to happen, right? The XAI cluster of chips, went from 100,000 chips to 200,000 chips, and now they're building out the expansion for 1 million chips. And this is specifically the next rounds of computational scaling, and not just more chips, but better chips, right? So not the NVIDIA H100, but the NVIDIA Blackwell, which is itself multiple times higher performing than those H100s. It is that sort of next generation of AI where China is going to be most severely degraded. And so right now, you look at DeepSeek R1 and you look at OpenAI, O3, and you say, like, yeah, it's not as good, but it's quote unquote good enough. But the point is, like, where we are going in the next year, in the next 2 years, is like a shocking degree of performance advancement. I mean, I've talked to so many people in the coding world, and these are like global leaders, like literally, like we're talking top 100 humans on Earth in like their very specialized domains of programming. And they say, like, there really has been a step change where in the beginning of 2024, even though they were involved in making advanced AI, they didn't find it that useful in doing their own work. And then in the middle of 2024, suddenly their job fundamentally changed. All day, every day, all they're doing is interacting with these AI coding assistants. And I think you're going to see with the next round of performance improvements, with the next round of scaling, that's not just going to be the phenomenon that coders are experiencing. That's going to be a phenomenon experienced by so many different job categories across the global economy, where AI goes from not that useful to shockingly everything is different now kind of useful. And the people who say, oh, DeepSeek is good enough, I think they will change their tune once U.S. firms hit that next round of scaling.
Yeah, of course, one of the things that's we return to again and again in our conversations here is that, AI is not a vertical. It's horizontal. It affects everything. And so the AI you need to help you do your job as advertising copywriter is many levels below the level you're talking about there. And the AI you need to be a pretty good radiologist, or to help you do your work at a radiologist, that may be in the middle of all of that. And of course, when you're talking about coding and diagnostics, I was just reading a piece about it the other day, you're right. If you've got all this power and you can run all this, or you're doing, developing drugs and you can develop all these kind of alternatives, having having that amount of power is a big advantage. But having said that, export controls are always kind of the beginning of the workaround, because, for a bunch of people, they're like, well, okay, well, I'm not going to get that. So how do I get there from here? There was a big debate with the whole small yard high fence thing. And people like Eric Schmidt were like, this is only going to really set them back 3 years. Mm-hmm. And other people were like 10 years. But nobody was like, it's going to set them back forever. What do we think the lag time is right now? Because the Chinese AI capability is good and getting better, right?
Mm-hmm. So, again, the export controls architecture is multiple interlocking stages, right? So we don't want them to, come along for the next round of the scale up of AI power, 10xing the amount of compute that's used to develop and serve these models. So if we don't want them to have the super advanced AI models and be able to operate them at scale, we don't want them to have the AI chips. If we don't want them to have the AI chips, that means that we don't want them to be able to make those AI chips domestically if we stop selling them, because there's no point in not selling them something that they could easily make themselves. So that gets into the export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment components, and also cutting them off from access to advanced chip fabs outside of China, like TSMC of Taiwan or like Samsung of South Korea. And if they get their act together in terms of fabbing chips, Intel of the United States. In this regard, I think there's really some important impacts, right away. And then there's some degradation in those impacts. And then there's sort of a longer term kind of impact. So what do I mean by that sort of different sequence? The first of which is that China has pretty good chip design. So NVIDIA is a chip designer. They don't manufacture the chips. They create the design, and then TSMC of Taiwan manufactures those chips on behalf of NVIDIA. Well, China has great chip design firms. Actually, HiSilicon, a subsidiary of Huawei, is a really good chip designer, just unambiguously. They're really talented folks. Other places like Cambercon are also quite good chip designers in China. So it's really about cutting them off from access to chip manufacturing. But before we get there, I want to point out that even if you have a great chip design, there are other sources of competitive advantage that matter in this market. So in the case of NVIDIA, other US companies like AMD, their chips are almost as good, sometimes even better, depending on what you're trying to accomplish in terms of chip design and in terms of like the most advanced degree of manufacturing. If you just look at an AMD chip and an NVIDIA chip, you would not guess that NVIDIA has more than 90% market share in this because they're pretty comparable products. Where NVIDIA really dominates is the surrounding software ecosystem. It is much, much easier to find a programmer who knows how to write AI software code for an NVIDIA chip than it is for an AMD chip. If you look at all the developer tools that are available to create AI code, it's just everything is compatible with NVIDIA, and there's not a ton of stuff that's compatible with AMD. So there's all these network effects that have already been built into in switching costs. And that actually does more to explain NVIDIA's dominance than the performance of their chips, which is, unambiguously good. So China faces a dual challenge. Their chips that they can make locally, like the Huawei Ascend chips, are much, much lower performing. That's the result of the export controls and not selling China the most advanced chip manufacturing equipment. And then on top of that, they have all those big network effect disadvantages because nobody knows how to write software for Huawei Ascend chips. The developer libraries for Huawei Ascend chips are garbage. So the Chinese government right now is literally putting pressure on DeepSeek. Hey, you need to migrate everything to Huawei Ascends. And DeepSeek is saying, please, please don't make us do that. Like, you will literally set us back many years if you force us to do this. And that's sort of the state of where we are right now. Like, even these degraded NVIDIA chips are a superior option just because of those network effects and those other options.
Yeah, although I would, just as a footnote, I was at NVIDIA at one point, and they were showing me their latest and greatest. And I was talking to them, well, what if Taiwan, what if there's a disruption and so forth? And they, we talked that through. But then they said, by the way, everything around the chip on the board, that comes from China. In other words, the fasteners and the little bits and pieces that they use come from China. So even they're dependent in some degree.
I just got to disagree with you there. I mean,
don't disagree with me. Disagree with the guy I was talking to from NVIDIA.
Yeah, but there's dependence, and then there's substitutable dependence, right? So we are dependent upon Taiwan for manufacturing our advanced AI chips. And if Taiwan was to get nuked right? Hypothetically, it would be, years before anybody could sort of replace what Taiwan does. I mean, Samsung is trying to catch up, Intel is trying to catch up, but it would literally set us back years in technology advancement. And then there would be an additional challenge of just rebuilding all the capacity, to manufacture at the scale, right? How hard would it be to go persuade some company in Germany, please make me some fasteners? I think NVIDIA could figure it out. Now, it may be currently unattractive because of the economics, right? So it may be the case that NVIDIA is, quote unquote, dependent in the terms of like, this is who we buy from. But if you were to think about like the worst case scenarios of like China tries to restrict supply, that sort of thing, could they go create other suppliers? Could they go identify other suppliers? I think what the United States, what Taiwan, what Korea does is significantly more irreplaceable than all the stuff that China does. Let me give it in another example that I think is more easily understood. In retaliation for U.S. export controls, China has placed export controls on gallium and germanium, which are two minerals that are actually really important in the manufacturing of, among other things, semiconductors. So you might think, oh my gosh, we're doomed. What are we going to do without Chinese gallium and germanium? Well, it is true that basically American mining companies basically are not in the business of gallium and germanium, or at least they weren't, a year ago when these export controls were announced. However, that's just because of the current state of the industry. Gallium and germanium are natural byproducts of mining aluminum and zinc. And so what that means is almost every aluminum miner or every zinc miner on planet Earth, if they wanted to get into the business of gallium or germanium, they could, just like that. It would take a year or so to build a refinery. But the basic point is what China cuts off access to is replaceable, is substitutable. But when you have these ultra advanced technologies, when you have these deep network effects in terms of like the software dependencies, it's a lot more irreplaceable.
Yeah, I'm sure there are degrees involved. I think what he was trying to say to me when I was talking to him was there are degrees of interdependence, and we would prefer not to have a complete breakdown in the relationship between the United States and China, because it helps us and helps where we're going.
I would also prefer that there not be a complete breakdown in relations between the United States and China. But I think you have to look at what China's intentions were even before we got on this adventure of export controls. If you look at Made in China 2025, it talks about eliminating Chinese use of all foreign-produced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, over a decadal timeframe. It talks about, China taking market share in all the various, chip stuff. And they actually got pretty close, to meeting their targets in Made in China 2025. And to the extent that they haven't hit their targets, often it's because of the export controls. If you look at other industries like electric vehicles, like solar panels, these are areas where American companies decided to, deeply integrate themselves into the supply chain of China, or to actually transfer technology to China. No export controls in any of those domains, and the U.S. companies in those areas are getting soaked in China right now. Tesla is really being ravaged by a Chinese EV supply chain that they helped create and upskill. So there's no export controls on electric cars, but if you ask, anyone, what is the future for American electric car companies in China, it is profoundly bleak. And so I want to just point out here that you have to sort of ask yourself, what is the counterfactual if the United States had not done these export controls? Well, according to Chinese policy document, it was to kick out the Americans even before we started on this export controls adventure.
Yeah, although, if you're sitting at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and one country says we're going to own the Industrial Revolution, sooner or later they're not going to be able to do that. And I think, there's a certain degree of folly, to say, well, we can own it. There's a lot of common sense to saying we can have an edge for a certain period of time. And I think, that's where sort of the more reasonable policies lie.
I think there's a big difference between like China and Yugoslavia, right? Like Yugoslavia is like, we're going to cut ourselves off from the world and we're going to build our own amazing domestic industries and we're going to be, largely self-sufficient. And the challenge they have is just the economy's not that large. So they can't really hit effective economies of scale in this, communist era autarkic system. The difference with China is that their internal market is big enough to hit meaningful economies of scale. And so that's why, you see that like Chinese tech giants, when China, completely blocked companies like Google, Yahoo, Amazon, Meta, from their domestic tech ecosystem, they created all these domestic tech giants. And then those companies actually end up being internationally competitive, not in all circumstances, but in a lot of circumstances. And that's because, China does have a domestic market that's large enough to hit interesting economies of scale.
So so China also has Taiwan, within arm's reach, which raises a lot of questions about the future. But let me conclude with one last set of questions. I was a trade official in the U.S. government, and I remember people beating a path to the door from every company saying, we want to have scale, we want to go out in the world, and the only way to do that is if we get regulatory harmonization, because we can't do 180 different versions of our product, right? And, we're in the early days of this, and we're nowhere near any kind of regulatory harmonization. This particular administration seems to be taking an unusual view towards trade, and they have strong views about regulation. So I don't know if we're going to get there sooner. To what extent do you see the regulatory disharmony or chaos globally as an impediment to AI companies reaching scale?
So I think, here we're talking mostly about the AI software part of the story, I assume, not the hardware chips part of the story. And there I would say it's pretty bleak. I mean, there is not going to be regulatory harmonization on AI anytime soon. But I think there's a more modest goal that conceivably could be achievable, and that's regulatory interoperability. And so what's the distinction there between harmonization and interoperability? Harmonization is like we have the same rules. Like you are, basically saying cars must get 55 miles to the gallon in America, and you must get whatever the kilometer equivalent of that is, kilometers per gallon in Europe. And it's like the same level on both things. That's regulatory harmonization. We're not going to get anything like that when it comes to AI regulation. Interoperability is more just like, can we even speak the same language? Do we define terms the same way? Do we have agreed upon measurements, right? So if Europe wants to say a car needs to get 100 kilometers to the gallon, and America says a car only needs to get 50 kilometers to the gallon, do we at least agree that kilometers per gallon is like the thing that we're measuring here? And that's sort of interoperability in an oversimplified sense. And I think that is the more modest goal for international collaboration on regulation that I think is still potentially achievable, although by no means guaranteed. I mean, the Biden administration did a lot of work to try and, link different agencies between the United States, between Europe, between Japan, countries like, Korea, et cetera, to kind of make all of this make sense so that at least there was alignments of standards and measurements, even if there wasn't necessarily alignments of rules. But that could all fall apart if it is neglected by, the U.S. government in this. And I think a lot of those cuts, for example, getting rid of probationary employees. Well, if you want to talk about, some of the good people in AI in the U.S. government, just because AI has been such a hot topic over the past 3 years, a lot of the best people in AI have been hired over the past 3 years. And so if you get rid of all these, probationary employees, you might be getting rid of a lot of your best talent, specifically in the area of AI. It's all the stuff where the topic is new and hot and recent. that is where your probationary employees are often the most important. And so it would be really unfortunate if we score an own goal on ourselves and get rid of all of that talent.
Yeah, also pissing off all your trading partners makes it more difficult to negotiate with them.
Totally agree.
Yeah, so I mean, we're in an interesting place. Look, there's a million things I could talk to you about. You're great and fascinating, and maybe we'll be able to persuade you to come back sometime to talk about more of it. But this was super helpful, and I don't really generally encourage people to listen to other podcasts because we have so many. But the AI policy podcast that you guys do over there is great. And I would encourage people to listen to that and to follow your work. And thank you very much, Greg.
Hey, well, thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.
And thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll be back with more Still Consciousness next week. We'll be back with more of our AI, energy, and climate podcast next week. And we got a couple of things to announce next week, which we think you'll find interesting. So join us again. Bye-bye.